In this episode, we're talking with Jacob Caine, the president of the REIV. Jacob represented the REIA at the 2024 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Azerbaijan. Now, we're going to explore the role of the real estate sector in realising emissions reduction targets. Are sustainable features in our homes worth something? What changes are afoot that will result in buyers being prepared to pay more for energy efficiency? Will there come a time where banks won't lend on homes with low energy ratings, and how close are we to experiencing a noticeable change in this space?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
Hi, I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, currently ranked number 3 in the MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, everything we talk about today is not personal advice, and we recommend you engage the services of a licensed and experienced professional.
Our guest today is Jacob Caine. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Ray White CRE, which is a family business he has led since 2012. He's now in his second term as President of the Real Estate Institute Victoria and is a Director of the Real Estate Institute of Australia. And not only is he a licensed real estate agent, but he's also educated himself outside the property arena, obtaining, amongst other things, a Master's in International Relations from Harvard University. And he's currently a PhD candidate at the ANU's National Security College, researching the evolution of cyber attack. And I only mention these things because it's easy to get carried away with popular rhetoric when discussing sustainability. And I'm sure Jacob is going to bring some intellectual rigour to this conversation. So I've just set the tone very, very high there, Jacob. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure, Veronica. Thanks for having me on.
Now, let's start with the Climate Change Conference, or COP29. Why did you go and what did you hope to achieve?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was there representing the Real Estate Institute of Australia. The REAA has, for the past sort of 12 to 18 months, really identified sustainability, energy efficiency, and the role of the real estate sector as one of the sort of key or core issues that we need to take the lead on, participate in, and understand, I suppose. And COP is the annual, conference held by the United Nations, where it brings together countries and representatives from industries that are actively participating in or wanting to participate in better energy efficiency and sustainability. Brings them all together in one space to talk about what measures need to be taken in order to realise a safer, more climate-friendly environment for ourselves and our children and our children's children's and future generations. So the REIA believes that it's an important event in which to, I suppose, signpost that Australian real estate is interested in participating in the transition to lower energy efficiency and greater sustainability.
Why does that matter? I mean, do they care? Those Aussies in that little country down the bottom of the planet, and, they got a bunch of homes down there. What have we got? 11 million homes down here. Why does that matter?
Look, it is important, and it's becoming increasingly so. And we can see the evidence of that, I suppose, playing out in real time in Los Angeles right now with regards to the fires. That they're not entirely a product of, but definitely contributed to by a changing climate, right? And of course, Los Angeles has suffered wildfires for in time in perpetuity since they started, actually moving into that space and living in that area. But we're not dissimilar here in Australia in terms of the types of landscapes and the type of challenges that we encounter with bushfires. And there is an increasing risk to Australians across the country throughout all of our major cities and our smaller satellite cities and towns of a changing climate and a risk to their homes, a risk to their livelihoods, a risk to their lives. And I think Australians do care of all countries in the world, we have the highest penetration rate of solar energy adoption. We have the most solar panels per capita of any country in the world. And that too is a signal of certainly an interest in an appetite for realizing the benefits of, better sustainability, greater energy efficiency. And the problem, I suppose, right now for us is that we've also been brought up in a world, in a country for us that's had time in perpetuity, cheap energy, and a fairly temperate climate, right? We don't have incredible extremes in terms of the weather. Of course, we suffer through some hot spells at times, but it's not massive extremes. We don't go into the negatives. We've never had to deal with sub-zero temperatures like our friends in Europe have had to deal with. So as a result, we've built houses that are almost uniformly not energy efficient because we haven't needed it, right? If we needed to cool them, energy was cheap. We'd get an air conditioner, we'd get a fan and we'd be right. As the climate changes, those challenges and occupying houses and dwellings in that changing environment is going to become more complex, more challenging and more costly. So it is a very important issue for Australians.
So sort of two ends of this continuum that we're sort of be considering here. At one end, you've got sort of major national disasters and we're natural disasters, and we've had floods, we've had bushfires, we've had cyclones, all that sort of stuff, right? And the damage to property and also lives is catastrophic. At the very other end of that, you've got individuals living in a home and whether or not it's comfortable, whether or not it's energy efficient, whether or not it's expensive to run, etc. And so we're sort of covering the whole spectrum here in many ways. So if we sort of go to the other end of the spectrum where we're talking about that more comfort and the fact that, we've got more a temperate climate in this country, you're based in Melbourne, right? And I know certainly when I was filming a show called Location a long time ago, whenever we filmed in Melbourne, it was all of a sudden heating was an issue. That we don't talk about heating in Sydney. You sure as hell don't talk about it in Brisbane. I don't think. It gets cold for a really tiny amount of the year and no one really worries about it in Brisbane. In Sydney, it's a bit different. But in Melbourne, it's obviously a major consideration and has been for a long time. And in fact, the Victorian government has, and we'll get to this a little bit later, I didn't want to talk about it right now, but the Victorian government has put in place some minimum housing standards for the rental market, for example. A lot of that is around heating, right? But over the building code has been steadily, increasing in terms of the energy ratings of properties. And I think what we've currently 7 stars is the minimum acceptable. Is that correct?
7.5, yeah.
7.5 now. We're going for 10. Is that the case?
Who knows where we'll land? Yeah, I mean, and that is an evolving scale as well. That needs to be revisited as well as technologies, as challenges evolve. So too does that scale to really capture what's going to be required to build a safe and comfortable and resilient home for someone in now and into the future.
So there's every year look, the federal government's trying to build 1.2 million new dwellings over a 5-year period, which I think everyone's accepted is not going to be achieved. And I think the most that's ever been built over a 5-year period is something like 1 million, and we've got 11 million at the moment. So that leaves the next 5 years is going to be 11 million properties currently existing that may not, get a very good rating. And in fact, CoreLogic recently released a report saying that more than 80% of Australia's houses has less than half the energy efficiency rating of the latest building codes, right? Which they're saying is putting owners at an increasing disadvantage as buyers seek homes with higher standards. Now, given we don't actually have a rating system in place yet for existing dwellings, how do we know if this analysis is correct?
So, I know that CoreLogic has been working with CSIRO on a particular product, Rapid Rater. There are other parties involved in that too, which has the capacity to rate properties at scale. The research behind that report is fairly diverse in terms of where they're feeding that information into it, and I think it's fair to say that it would, in all likelihood, it's very representative of the current state of properties within Australia. And you've hit the nail on the head, really, in terms of the challenge here. The challenge for the world let alone Australia, is the buildings that are already built. Houses, apartment buildings, office buildings, right? Moving forward, we don't have to worry nearly as much because of those energy efficiency standards that you've referred to. Anything built from today is going to be much, much better than the average property in Australia. It's about what we do with those properties. The number of buildings on Earth will double between now and 2050. Right. So just try to comprehend that the number of buildings, but all of the buildings across the face of the planet built over thousands of human existence, there'll be twice as many in 25 years.
Wow.
But we don't have to worry about them, right? Because of those standards. It's the challenge in front of us is addressing those issues there. So,
well, actually we do if they're not built in countries that have these standards.
These standards, yeah. Look, it's an absolutely valid point, yeah. And look, the global south, as they refer to it, particularly in an international context, that is a massive challenge because most of those buildings will be built there, and their access to the type of technology, the type of building material, the supply chains that we have here in Australia, that we're have the luxury of being able to tap into really readily, despite the fact that we're as far away from everyone as possible, but we still enjoy that privilege. It's much harder to secure energy efficient appliances, like eco-friendly materials for the construction of those properties. So again, it's not without its problems, but thinking of the established built environment. Now, you said in the absence of a rating system. Now, there are rating systems across the country. We've got the NAPERS and we've got the NABERS, right? So the NABERS is the nationwide house energy rating scheme, and that applies to residential builds. And then you've got the NABERS, which is the National Australian Built Environment System, which applies more to buildings and commercial spaces. Now, they represent, in terms of the ratings across the country, I don't know exactly, but it's somewhere in the vicinity of 90% of houses and buildings that have been rated using those systems, which are a nationally sort of accredited and run system. Now, the other thing about that is right now there is a mandatory disclosure framework group, right, which is conceiving the means by which and the process by which disclosure of all ratings, NADERS and NABERS on all buildings will come into effect. Right. And it's still in the planning phase, but there's a document you can find out there, the Home Energy Ratings Disclosure Framework, version 2 came out in December. And essentially that maps out what it'll look like. There's still decisions to be made around the timing of that, but it is coming, right? And that will mean at the point of sale or lease that a property has to have a NATERS or a NABERS rating in all of the advertising material, on the contract of sale, on any information relating to it, on boards outside the front of the property. It's been proposed that rating is sitting there. Now, knowing that it's coming, there's a question for the real estate sector is, are we going to get ahead of those changes and be active participants, or are we going to just be the victims of it, as we have been with a lot of legislation that's been introduced in recent years, where we've sat there and been kind of opposed to change or resistant to change, and then it's come about and we're like, Christ, this is a lot of extra work, or this sucks, and we go and complain to government, but they're never going to wind back any of that stuff. And that again, coming back to your original question about why REIA wants to be there and send someone to COP, it's to be on the front foot with regards to these coming changes.
Got it. Interesting. We did interview Cecile Weldon late last year and around this rollout across the states and where it's up to, and we understand that it is coming, but obviously it's not here yet. And it will be interesting because, different states have different vendor disclosures regimes. You've got states like WA, Tasmania, and Queensland's changing, but where they've had to give very little information to buyers by legislation. And obviously New South Wales, Victoria, ACT, they're somewhat similar in terms of what vendors have traditionally or has been legislated that we've had to give prospective buyers. And so some states will be more used to that in terms of getting additional certification, documentation or whatever, and others will be less used to it. Buyers will be more or less used to it, I guess, based on where they are. I think it's interesting, though, because I look at, say, the CoreLogic report. It says that Sydney, the median rating of pre-2010 houses is 2.4 versus 7.5, right? Where in Melbourne, it's 3.5 and Brisbane's it's 3.1. And obviously, cities with older housing stock are likely to have a lower median rating, right? Because there's more stock that's old. Would it be fair to say then that in a city such as Sydney, where you've got a lot more established properties, that even though there's a rating, if every rating in a suburb is 2, then is that going to make a marked change in terms of buyer behaviour? You know, they're just all going to accept, everything in this suburb's 2 out of 7.5. Do you know what I mean? So I sort of wonder still whether it's going to be more meaningful, that you're going to see a more meaningful difference in prices between, you know, those more and lesser efficient homes in perhaps cities where they've already got more newer properties, or suburbs where there's newer properties. Because it's a behavioural thing too, isn't it, right? If
Absolutely.
the vendor doesn't feel like, well, God, everybody else's house is rated 2.5, I don't need to go and spend money before I sell my home, or I don't need to spend money now to shore up the value over time. Because I'm just wondering how long it's going to take for this to actually really become meaningful.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you bang on that's potentially problematic. And what I think, and we're seeing this more in the commercial market than in the resi market, right, is that the market itself is starting to make these decisions. So a lot of commercial tenants now, and it's a combination of ESG, you know, so environmental social governance, right, but it's and regulation, right? So larger companies in Australia now and in other jurisdictions around the world, like big companies, have to report on their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, right? So for those listening that don't know what that is, effectively that's your direct, you know, adjacent to and downstream emissions, right? So like scope 3 is, you know, if you have someone deliver something to your office on a regular basis, it's like, well, what does that what's the truck? Is it coming in a diesel truck, or is it coming in an electric truck, right? So it's quite complex, yeah. So those bigger companies, now that they have to report on those, right? Well, they're making decisions about, well, we won't occupy premises that aren't at X rating, right? That don't have zero embedded carbon, that have zero emissions. They're making those decisions, and then developers around that are therefore building developments and creating office spaces, commercial spaces that are incredibly world leading in some instances here in Australia, world leading in terms of their energy efficiency. There's a building in Melbourne being built with 100% solar skin, right? So like the exterior of the building's generated, it's phenomenal, right? So some amazing stuff happening in that space. Now, as a result, they're getting higher rents for those spaces, and tenants are demanding them. So we're creating a market for it. The same thing is happening and will continue to happen at an accelerating rate in the residential space, right? Because the differentials, 13% of childhood asthma is a byproduct of gas in homes, right? That home energy ratings disclosure framework details in their report, that version 2 report I referenced before, something 6.6% of temperature-related deaths are a result of cold, poorly insulated homes, right? So there are better health outcomes. It's demonstrated through the data across the board for more energy-efficient houses, for more environmentally friendly houses. Then there's the cost differential as well in terms of what it takes to run a property. Add in some regulation around that. You've referred to the Victorian government's proposed energy efficiency standards, right? And then we start to reach a sort of critical mass, like a tipping point whereby we change from, all it takes is a few properties online that have that rating that sell for much more than the other property for that to create an impetus for change, right? You know, to your point, if every 2-story terrace in Paddington, right, has a 2-star rating, but then someone does an incredible refurb and they've got an 8.5, a 9-star rating, and they've got it's a passive house and it's completely off grid. It it's got a battery, it's got the full catastrophe, right? It costs $0 to run it from an energy perspective, and it sells for an absolute mozza. Then you've created the precedent there, and people will follow because people are ultimately sheep. Like they want to follow those patterns. They want the same result for themselves. And so one thing, I think sales agents are going to be critical in this. We already do this, right? You know them, I know them, right? You go into a house that's going up for sale and you go, all right, this is a dump. Let's get it painted. Let's get it recarpeted. Let's get it styled, right? Agents are going to start going, let's get solar panels on it. Let's get induction stovetops. Let's put it in a heat pump, right? Because buyers will come in and say, oh, next door's for sale as well, and it's energy efficient. It's got 8.5. It's going to cost me $200,000 to do this, so I'll offer you $200,000 less for this house, when really it might cost you $15,000 to do that.
I think I can see that happening in market conditions such as you got in Melbourne at the minute. When it's a buyer's market, because as well as I do that in a hot market, the differential between, say, a renovated, forget sustainability for a minute, a renovated home and an unrenovated home, the difference in price in a hot market does not equate to the amount of money it's going to take to turn that unrenovated home into the renovated home. It forces people to go for properties that they wouldn't normally go for in order to be in an area they want to be in, and they'll just that's a problem for future homer. That's a problem for future homer in terms of, I'll worry about how I'm going to renovate down the track. I just want to get in, and I'm going to drop all my standards and all my requirements. So I sort of wonder about the human behavior. I can get the corporate behavior with the ESG reporting and all that sort of stuff, because in a commercial space it's there's different imperatives. And certainly I just know how consumers behave in different market environments. So it's sort of interesting in terms of the actual differential. I think it will make a big difference, but in certain market conditions. That's my personal thinking on that.
Yep, 100% ballot. Again, the market and the corporate world will lead the way in this, right? And you touched on it on the intro, but what happens, right? So banks, that they have to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? Mortgage books, is that scope 3? Right? Risk on the mortgage book. They look at Rapid Rater rates the mortgage book of the CBA and goes, your risk exposure on this is off the charts, right? Because of climate change, because of increasing numbers of catastrophic weather events, because of the average rating of the property. To insure this book is going to cost X amount more. So they're faced with a choice, right? Do we cut these properties, like we call in the mortgage, we can't finance you anymore unless you upgrade. And then do they offer that person that lives in that property a heavily, heavily discounted rate purely for the upgrade of the property? And then when a buyer's coming for finance and looking at a property, and they go, what's the natters? And they're like, we won't lend to you unless you also borrow $150,000 explicitly to upgrade it, or the owner undertakes to upgrade it prior to settlement, or whatever the case may be. So they will force it too, because that is the direction that the world's going in. The put aside the social and the economic, the social and the environmental, the economic and imperative has changed all the way around this space.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at behavioural change, there's lots of different aspects to it. So it's that the carrot and the stick type of thing, and nudging behaviour, and you want rapid change, and that's probably one of the bigger levers that we've got at our disposal. Can we talk for a bit? Well, actually, before we move on to the next sort of angle here, with regards to that, is that actually happening, or is that being talked about as an eventuality that is certain or very assured?
Yeah. So the extreme of not lending to someone with a low rated energy efficient house is not happening. Not at all. I know for a fact that banks are looking at their mortgage books right now, and assessing them on the scope 3 and the risk. The resilience of the portfolio is the other big. We talk about energy efficiency, but resilience is the other. There's two major factors when we talk about the transformation of the built environment, because the reality is.
Sorry, when you say resilience, do you mean sort of like, protection from natural disasters and that type of resilience? Is that what you mean? Right.
Yeah.
Not
absolutely.
prone to bushfires?
But it can be at the lower end of the spectrum too, right? It's like, what are the materials that have been built? What's the quality of the build? What's the skin of the build, and how susceptible is it to increasing temperatures, right? Like, how is it going to deteriorate much more quickly because it hasn't been built to a certain standard using the right kind of materials, that it hasn't been finished in a certain way, because it's sitting on the block in the wrong dimension, because it's got a black roof rather than a white roof. It's things like that. It's very trendy to have a black roof right now.
I know.
But it raises the ambient temperature of suburbs by having it, because it captures and retains the heat. It's decisions like that. So,
but that's...
Sorry, jump in.
Sorry, that said, but, when you fly anywhere, which of course is not great for the environment either, and you look down on the roofs of these new subdivisions, there's a lot of very monument-coloured roofs, like, it's the fact that we've got these standards in place, it doesn't seem to translate into... quite pretty simple, wouldn't it, just to outlaw dark roofs? But they still get built. So there's obviously some swings and roundabouts on these ratings.
Yeah. Well, look, monument, you hit the nail on the head. Whoa, how many billions of litres of that paint are they selling every year? And yeah, you're absolutely right. You fly over. As long as the property's still at 7.5, stars energy efficiency, then so be it. I suppose that's better. It's better than a tile roof on a house that sits at 2 stars or 2.5 stars, because that thing in Melbourne, like you said, when it gets cold, that thing is just chugging through the electricity. That the gas it's just burning through gas like it's going out of fashion. So, but it's definitely something. We've too many accusations of nanny state being thrown around, particularly here in Victoria, to contemplate, for the government to contemplate saying, let's ban.
You only have to have white roofs.
Dark roofs. Yeah, right. Can you imagine, right? But that is absolutely something that we need to contemplate as a society moving forward.
Because predictably, home builders have criticised any updates or upgrades to the building code, let's face it, and generally they're saying that imposing sort of minimum star ratings on new homes make them too expensive. But I think even in the sense that they're obviously foregoing easy solutions, which is giving them white roofs, for other choices. But do they have a point that it makes these properties too expensive?
Yeah, look, right now it's more expensive. There's no argument around that. That will shift, like everything, once we reach a tipping point. To the builders, look, don't get me wrong, I love them, but they're just like us as real estate agents, right? They're really resistant to change, right? And I was at a forum with lots of builders, and there was a very high ranking sort of person in the building industry space who said, we haven't changed anything materially about the way we do things for decades, right? Like, we're still using ostensibly the same method, systems, processes, materials across the board, that we were doing, in the 1990s, right? So, but despite that, there's been massive change in terms of what's available from a material perspective. But the counterpoint to that is, well, as you said before, the government wants 1.2 million homes built across the country to tackle a very immediate challenge in terms of people not being able to find a safe and affordable home to live in. So it's an incredibly complex and horrible problem to address, but things will continue to change. The cost will shift. It's already happening. Gas and electricity, right? Just think about that. Like, gas is way more expensive than it used to be now, right? Electricity renewable electricity is so much cheaper than any other form to generate, to produce, right?
I just listened to a podcast literally this morning on, it was Cameron Murray's, what's his podcast called? He's been a guest on the show, and he interviewed somebody who has been doing a lot of work in this space, and they're actually saying things that contradict that. So I'm
Was it Peter Dutton? Was that his
No,
guest?
it wasn't. No. It was actually somebody, he's actually an electrical engineer who's apparently on this, I can't remember his name, but it was actually really fascinating, and it challenged a lot of my thinking on this, because I'm very much for example, I mean, this is going off the back of me listening to this podcast. It talked about that our solar panels on roofs is actually causing a problem for the electricity grid, because it needs to be turned off at times. So there's base load power. There's all these technical stuff that none of us understand. And my logic, because I don't know anything about electricity or electrical engineering, is that we've got all these rooftops. Why aren't we putting solar on everything? But of course, solar, the sun doesn't shine in the middle of the night, and we don't have batteries big enough to store. And so there's lots of issues there. But they're actually basically saying that per kilowatt, the cents per kilowatt of coal-fired, and I definitely want less coal, fossil fuels happening. But actually, the cents per kilowatt for coal is something to the magnitude of like a third the price of cents per kilowatt of sustainably generated. So I just think that this argument, or this whole conversation, probably needs a little bit more, I don't know, it's very political, and there's a lot of commonly held logic that, people such as myself, I call myself progressive, go, yeah. But I'm starting to think it's obviously a hell of a lot more complicated than we thought. And they even talked about the environmental issue of where and how the solar panels are manufactured, and at what cost the environment, the whole chain. So quite fascinating. So anyway, a bit of a digression there.
No. It's look, you need to think about the life of the product, the life of the material that goes into
the origin of it,
solving the problem, and the origin, how it's transported, all of those factors. And again, that's what Scope 3 emissions are, right? In terms of understanding that if you source something from somewhere, it needs to be measured across those 1, 2, and 3s, which is happening in the corporate world, not so much here, not in the context
of the residential world
that we're talking about,
yeah.
Right? But going back to COP for a second, in terms of the phenomenal people that do congregate at these conferences on an annual basis. Now, I mean, that Arena was there, and that's the Australian. I've forgotten the acronym, what it stands for explicitly, but Renewable Energy Association, and they were doing a presentation on storage, right? We have already all of the technology that we need. We don't need to develop anything new, like to completely transition away from fossil fuel energy and onto wind, water, and solar, right? We have all of that capacity, all of the technologies, medium, short-term, and long-term storage available. So this question around the grid, the question around, the sun doesn't shine at night, right? Like that, I can see the people that work in this space around the world, I hear them pulling their hair out, like at those responses, right?
Okay.
From people out there. Not you. I'm not saying you. I'm saying like that kind of rebuttal to the argument for going down this path.
It's not even so much a rebuttal, it's a challenge, and it has to be addressed, because it's a fact. I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. Most people don't realise that they can cost themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars over the medium to long term when they make property decisions without all of the information that they need. And what I do is help people with tricky real estate problems, which often masquerade as simple questions like, should I sell my investment property because the interest repayments are hurting? Or should I buy before I sell? Or the other way around. You can connect with me and access all of the tools that I've created to help you make better property decisions at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you will find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program. You can connect with my Sydney-based property management and buyer's agency teams, Australia-wide vendor advocacy, or ask me for introduction to the small group of buyer's agents that I would personally recommend across the country. That's veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and, importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via my website, alcove.com.au.
Well, the sun doesn't shine at night. Yeah, that is a fact. Yeah, that's yes. I'm not going to argue with that one. But in terms of our capacity to manage that, like to deal with that is not a factor in this space anymore, right? It's not a concern. There's a dude from Stanford University in California who was there, who did a presentation on, and he and his team have modeled out what it would take from a financial perspective to transition the entire world off fossil fuels and onto wind, water, and solar. To generate that sufficient energy, more than sufficient energy, store it, deploy it, etc. And the figure was, I forget if it was 52 or 56 trillion. I think it was $52 trillion to do it. That's the investment required, but the payback time for it would be 6 years.
Interesting.
So it would pay back in terms of 6 years, and he modeled beyond that things like health outcomes, deaths from pollution related issues, and modeling it out to zero over a period of sort of 10, 15 years where all of the residual impacts, etc., are negated.
So that's the investment. So assuming that if you invested it today, that we will have all the necessary resources to roll it out, what would the rollout period be in their modelling?
Yeah, well, that's also multiple years. It's based on a best case scenario whereby you could source, to your point, all of the materials, etc., on a today's cost and implement it over, a 2 to 3 year period.
I guess what you're saying, though, is a lot of work going into solving this difficult problem.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, like you walk out of something like that simultaneously inspired, frustrated, and terrified.
Right.
Inspired by the incredible energy and intellect and determination of the people, whether they're from governments or whether they're from industry, and you'd be astounded at the industries that are there. Like nuclear is there. I met with the Australian Forestry Council. Like they're all there, and they want to participate. They want to contribute. They want to be part of a positive change. Then you're frustrated by the fact that you hear things like this, and you see these things that Google are doing, and going, right, like we have what we need to do it, but we're not doing it. And then that's terrifying. That's terrifying to think about what the implications, because there are lots of scientists already that think 1.5 degrees is blown. That's Hackney, right? It's done and dusted. That's a fantasy to think that we're going to keep it under that. And they that's why for banks the resilience piece is so critical, because it doesn't matter even if you're in a really safe area. I bet you a lot of people in the Pacific Palisades thought they were in a safe area too until a week or two ago.
Well, yeah, I mean that is a remarkably when you do look at the aerial shots and think, shit, that's just the suburbs. You're not thinking, I mean, the outer suburbs on the edge of bushland, yeah, you maybe could imagine that. I mean, streets have been taken out or some streets in some areas of Sydney, for example, or Victoria or Melbourne have been taken out. But yeah, that is quite alarming. I think you're talking about sort of the risk side of things and the resilience of property and the banks' view of that, and how that they're going to look at their loan books and that's going to change things there. But what about the insurance companies? Because, of course, the insurance situation in the US, as I understand, is very different to what it is here. And My understanding, and maybe this is totally out of both of our lanes here, but my understanding in this country is that every house has to be able to be insured, and it's a federal thing, my understanding, whereas over in America it's a state-based thing, and when insurance companies pull out, then the state has to basically play insurance company, and there's a lot of properties there. There's 12,000 properties have been destroyed, and a lot of them have been insured by the state government because they couldn't get privately insured. So,
It'd
this
be catastrophic. Yeah,
talking
it's
about risk.
catastrophic.
It's
But,
yeah,
that's right. Yeah, from a financial perspective, and this is the thing that I think that ultimately, if you don't believe in climate change, I don't know. The weight of evidence is so overwhelming, right? Some people don't. Okay, fair enough. If you don't want to participate, if you're ideologically opposed to it because politically, you think that these people are, lefties or socialists or whatever the case may be, the economic imperative is just overwhelming now. Like, just to protect yourself, just to save money, just to make money, right? Like that's happening in the ACT. So they've got mandatory reporting on their properties. And the differential between high energy efficiency and low energy efficiency properties for both purchase and lease is double-digit percentage.
right. So it's now being measured there. So that's our test case.
Yeah. So I forget the exact figures. It's something like 19% higher sale prices.
Really?
And 14-15% higher rental prices for higher energy efficiency properties.
And I'm going to be devil's advocate here because, I love data, I like digging into data. But so I think to myself, okay, if a property is likely to be a higher energy efficient rating, it's probably more renovated than a house that isn't. So how much of that is actually due to their energy rating versus whether it's just a nicer, a newer renovation?
Yeah, who knows? I can't measure it, but it's part of what a renovation looks like now and is going to look like moving forward. Yeah.
So the Victorian government is leading the way with legislating minimum rental standards, and they will start to come into effect in October this year. Now, these have been pretty unpopular with a lot of property managers and landlords. You certainly can understand the landlord's point of view. They're being that the responsibility is put on them. It's an onerous responsibility in terms of cost. The government's average, it's going to be something like $5,500 per property. And property managers have been left to manage it, to implement it, to roll it out. And we also know that the sector has some of the poorest quality housing, the rental sector, and many rental properties are energy inefficient and poorly maintained. And I'm certainly not condoning that. But some industry commentators have suggested that the most vulnerable could now be completely priced out of the private rental market because there's sort of this inadvertent gentrification, if you like, that comes from this. Is this just collateral damage, that what's driving this legislation isn't so much about living standards, rather, working towards these bigger sustainability targets?
100%. Yeah. This has been a big one for us here in Victoria. Here I am sitting. I am very much an advocate for the need to transition the established built environment to a higher level of energy efficiency. I think that's probably clear from the conversation we've had thus far. I'm pretty cynical about the purported reason for the introduction of these laws in Victoria. I think you've hit the nail on the head there again. This is not about improving living standards. It's about the government in Victoria reaching their 2030, 2040 and 2050 emissions reduction targets, because they know that without doing this, they don't hit those targets. And so that's fine, right? But if this is about you guys reaching commitments that you've made, which the electorate supports, they voted them in, so on, like these are, popular aspirations of the government, then you need to give back in order to help the people that are going to deliver it for you achieve those outcomes. And that's the problem. We're in the worst rental conditions probably ever experienced in this country, and there is no difference there in Victoria in terms of the acute increase in cost for rental properties, the acute increase in cost for holding investment properties for those rental providers, as we call them in Victoria, landlords everywhere else in the country, right? And housing affordability and cost of living generally, right? So to introduce a raft of legislation in one lump, and that cost, you said $5,500 was what they said was the maximum cost,
Right.
not the average, the maximum. But that is an absolute fantasy. If you think about your 2-story terrace house in Paddington, it's not going to cost $5,500 to get that insulated. It's not going to get to get that energy efficiency, to phase out gas, to put in a heat pump, right? It will cost tens of thousands of dollars to realise that. And so much of the rental housing stock in Victoria looks like that, right? It's period homes, right? It's those homes that were built in the 70s and the 60s, right? Which were, in a very temperate climate with bugger all insulation, no consideration of where it sits on a block in terms of, the heat that it gets throughout the course of the day. They have old hot water services. They have heaps of gas going into it. They're probably gas heated, right? So it's a very complex challenge to actually address that issue and get those properties up to a level that the government wants them to be at. Now, I don't believe that all of those changes will come in this October.
Yeah, I've read through sort of the rollout, and it's interesting because I think it's interesting to see what they're prioritising. Obviously, ceiling insulation, draft ceiling. I guess when people got windows that rattle and doors that have big gaps under them and stuff like that. There's hot water systems. Their estimated cost on a hot water system is $361. So I totally concur with you. I think the $5,500 is way under. Shower heads, and the blind cord safety anchors. They're the sort of the cheap bits.
We can do them.
Yeah,
we'll do them now.
easy to do. And the heating and cooling, $1,790 for heating and cooling of an average home, which is like, really, that's so interesting. And they've missed out really obvious things like external blinds on the west-facing windows. That's the draft ceiling is really obvious, but there's some other things that they've completely missed out. But I think, it is a bit of an imposition, don't you think, on the industry as well? We talk this topic around here is really what our responsibility as real estate agents is. And this has really been imposed, not just on the owner, the rental providers or the landlords, not just on them, because they're not even all Victorians. Like, they're not even all people that did actually vote your government in. And in fact, there's been something like, I think, the end of the year, there was something like 25,000 less rental property providers or properties being provided, shall we say, in Victoria than there were at the beginning of the year. So it is actually having a negative, this amongst other things. Of course, you've got land tax and whatever else is going on down there. But, they are having a negative impact on the sentiment amongst investors. And obviously prices are falling. There's a number of other things that cause people to want to get out of the Melbourne in particular, but the Victorian property market. So, but back to where I was going with this, that has been imposed on your business, on others like you. Obviously, you're the president of the REIV. I was actually one of the judges of the REIV, the Property Manager of the Year award, actually, and reading all those submissions. That was such a common theme of the role of the property managers had to step up to explain this to their property rental providers, to their clients anyway. And that is an impost on the industry. Do you agree?
Without question, yeah. I think, look, two things can be true at the same time, right? I think with regard to property managers, now their roles during and post the pandemic have just radically changed in terms of the expectations, in terms of where they spend their time, how they spend their time. And in the Victorian context, the legislative changes that have happened, particularly around minimum standards and these proposed new energy efficiency minimum standards, has made it's been a massive impost, to borrow your term. And they've had to learn a lot and they've had to explain a lot. And on the other side of the equation, when it comes to those landlords, rental providers, investors, as you said, 25,000 less bonds in being held by the RTBA, which means that there's 25,000 less properties available for renters, which, again, we were already in an acute housing shortage from a rental perspective.
And your population's going up, right?
Correct. Yep. Massive increases in terms of population over the last 24 months. And guess what? All of those new arrivals to Australia are renters, right? They rent until they can get enough money to buy, right? Traditionally, that's at least 2 years, So the rental population, and this is the case everywhere in the country, is only ever going to increase. This notion, it is a completely different conversation. This notion that we can recapture the past in terms of home ownership rates is a fantasy. It's an absolute fantasy. It's not going to happen. And we have to come to terms with that and shift the rental system. Back to the property managers, their role has transformed. In some respects, even though I don't like the manner in which it's happened and the context in which it's happened, it's really important because technology is coming in at such a rate into the particularly the property management space that so many aspects of that role, the traditional aspects of that role, are starting to be automated, starting to be handled in a much more tech-based way. Then their value has to become their value to their clients, to businesses, to society broadly, has to become about being an advisor as opposed to just someone who signs off on the form and ticks off on any of the applications and so on and so forth. Like, it's not about repetitive tasks anymore. Wherever they can be automated, they will be automated, and all that leaves is the human capacity, the human intelligence to add value to a relationship. So I think even though it's been super challenging because they're wrestling the disparate duties that they've had and the expansion of that role into someone who needs to explain and educate and assess, right? That's the general trajectory for property managers moving forward anyway. So it's a painful transition, but a necessary one at the same time.
And it's exciting. I mean, certainly I had launched a property management business in Sydney last year, and it's an exciting challenge. And, some agencies will step up to that, but we all know that many won't. Anyway, that's another topic for another conversation.
Absolutely.
Just a final question for you before I'm going to ask you for a property dumbo. Wouldn't we get a bigger impact if we just first focused our attention on apartment buildings rather than individual houses?
It's really interesting that you say that. I keep referring back to that home energy ratings disclosure framework paper. But the number of, and they contemplate this question, right, in the forum, basically, is like, what's the best way to tackle this? And they have, they go through each one and sort of assess the pros and cons. And the number of individual dwellings is very significantly higher than apartments, right? So single dwellings as opposed to houses as opposed to apartments. Let's use that terminology, right? And that's in the rental space as well.
Really?
Right. So you'd think most renters live in apartments, but that's a very metro urban. Like we're city folk, aren't we?
Yes.
They all. I have a property management business, and I would say 95% of our renters live in apartments, but that shifts the further you go out, right? And when you go across the country, there's more renters living in individual houses than there are in apartments.
But as prices go up, do you think that's going to change? Because it becomes uneconomic for a lot of investors to continue to rent out houses, particularly with maintenance, increased costs. I know in Sydney, for example, even the price of properties there's less and less investors wanting to buy houses.
Yeah, there's a few things that will drive it. Like as you say, the rental yields on a house have never been as good as an apartment.
No.
Right? You buy for capital gains. That's
Yeah.
why probably for the most part that the block of land with the house on it's going to appreciate at a higher rate than the apartment. We all know that, and that's
In the
probably
same location.
in the same location. Yeah, good distinction. Yeah,
As long as
absolutely.
it's not on a main
Qualify
road
that.
or a really weird block. I mean, there's a whole bunch of qualifiers. On balance, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So Sydney's the second least least affordable housing market in the world. Melbourne, despite its woes over the past 12 months, is still the seventh least affordable housing market in the world. We're probably tapping out. I know no one wants to hear that, but like, how will anyone afford properties anymore? Okay.
Well, actually, we can have another discussion on this as well.
We might be getting into it.
Yeah. Because there's a stat. Look at there's two things I've got to say there. One is that when you're already in a market, you've already got a certain amount of equity to upgrade into another property in that same market. You're not starting from a standing start. Like you've got a head start against anybody new in the market. So it becomes its own entity, if you like. That market, people trade within the market, and that's what happens. Hard for newcomers to come in. But also when you see there's three things actually: the bank of mum and dad, and the way that's actually reinforcing prices. It's often in the same city because they're wanting to help their children and grandchildren to buy into the same city, and then their property, that wealth, if you like, is actually them being used to continue the price growth. But the other way in which I think governments are now intervening is in the shared equity schemes. So there's another way to continue to continue price growth, or at least sustain values.
No, 100%. Yeah, no, you're bang on. And look, there's two things that can happen. Like we continue the trend that we're on, which is effectively consolidating the ownership of all property into an ever declining proportion of the population. Right, which
and
is
ultimately that will slow things down in the long run. Yeah,
that's right. So the other massive impact, and this is the theme of today is sustainability, energy efficiency. The only way that the world solves this problem too is to build medium density. Right, our streetscapes, our city needs to look more like Paris
or Barcelona.
Barcelona, yeah, exactamundo, right? Like that's what our streetscapes need to look like in 10, 30, 15, 30 years down the track, right? More energy efficient than those beautiful old, Haussmann, boulevard designed places in Paris, right? But that level of built upness, right? Because it is economically impossible to continue to spread in the way the urban sprawl that we have done, because it's impossibly expensive to build infrastructure and amenity to service those ever increasing and stretching boundaries of the city limits, the metropolitan zone. And because from an environmental perspective, we need to go up, not super up, but just up, to consolidate that, because we will run out of land in which to grow food to eat.
Yeah,
right? We will run out of green space. We will run out of oxygen if we continue to spread in the way that we have. So the concept of every Australian owning a 600 square meter block with a 4-bedroom house and a driveway and a couple of cars, like that, the Australian dream needs to shift very radically in order to realise a sustainable future for our country and for the world.
I think that's a good note to finish this discussion on. Jake, we like to finish every episode with a short property dumbo. Did you come prepared with a story that helps us to understand or learn something from a mistake that maybe you've made or somebody that you know?
So it's hard to identify explicitly who the dumbo in this situation is. You could say us in some respects, or potentially the vendor of a property that we had for sale. This is a few years back now, but we had a couple who we were selling property for in one of the core marketplaces. I won't say explicitly where.
Keep it vague.
A beautiful Victorian era property. We'd agreed throughout the course of the campaign that the quote range on the property, as we have to do here in Victoria, would be $3.4 to $3.7 million. There was heaps of interest throughout the course of the campaign at that price point. We had, coming into the auction day, we had 4 or 5 parties registered and ready to purchase the property. Now, the day before the auction, we had an auction reserve set meeting. Now, the vendors of this property lived in a different state. They lived up in New South Wales. They were from Sydney. They came down, had a meeting with us, and we sat in the reserve set meeting with these people who we hadn't actually met face to face. We'd only ever spoken to them on the phone. This is pre-COVID, pre-Zoom meetings, so on and so forth. And they said they refused to set the reserve during that meeting. And they said, we will come to the auction tomorrow, and half an hour before the auction, we'll let you know what our reserve will be. Now, this isn't our usual practice. We'd like to have that absolutely done and dusted. We particularly in the Victorian context, we don't want to be going into that auction with labouring under any misapprehension about where the price will sit. So we get to auction day the next day, and half an hour before, no sign of the vendors. We call the vendors, hey, you guys still coming? No response. Repeatedly calling. 3 or 4 different team members. The crowd is assembling on the street. They've been to the open for inspection before. They would be in the vicinity of 75 to 100 people. And eventually, just moments before the auction was scheduled to start, my father, Paul, was doing the auction. He got a call back from the vendors, and they said, we're not coming. The reserve price will be $4.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
Right now. That's highly problematic. It was highly problematic for us as a business, as individuals, and from a legislative perspective in the Victorian context.
You've also got no time to do anything about it.
No time to do anything about it. So we had because it was at the time it was quite a high, a big deal of a property in the suburb. We had a few of our team members there, so we had a quick conference, and they said, Paul said, they've just said this, do we proceed with the auction? Do we not? Do we cancel the auction? What do we do in your conference? And we decided, right, because there were a lot of long-term clients, people in the suburb who knew us really well, and the interested parties, we decided to go and disclose what had happened to each of those people prior to.
Did you tell them the exact number, or did you just say it's a lot higher than you expected?
Yeah, we've said it's been set completely beyond the range that we quoted. We valued it here. Your interest, we know, was in that range or potentially slightly above it. But if it gets there, phenomenal. But we don't hold any hope that that's the case. But we wanted to let you know that that's the case. So
you're bidding for the right of the right to negotiate, as opposed to bidding to win.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we held the auction. It passed in at 3.7, the top of the range, which in and of itself was a bit problematic reputationally. We were okay from a legislative perspective, but we were actually really worried that someone would have bid above the 3.7, which was the top of the range.
And then you pass it in.
We're underquoting. Yeah. So anyway, as a postscript, so the lesson out of that, right, is that you have to understand, the psyche. You need to know your vendors well enough going into a sales campaign. But the postscript to this one, which is the point of interest, after the auction, this woman and her 3 children, adult children, come up to us and say, have you seen blah, 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 the name of the vendor, the husband in the partnership? And we said, yeah, we met with him yesterday. Do you know him? And she said, he's my father. I haven't seen him for 2 years since he married this woman.
Oh, wow. Right?
And we think that she's been keeping him prisoner in their basement, in their house in Sydney. And we were like, are you talking about?
Wow.
And she came in, she was crying. She's like, I'm so relieved that he's alive. I can't believe it, and that the kids were like, oh, thank God, grandpa's alive. Like this full kid, and we were like, oh my God. And so anyway, we coordinated a meeting where we called them into the office the next day to sort out their marketing, because they had like $25,000 in marketing, which they hadn't paid. And we said, come into the office. And we had the daughter come in and meet them there. And it was like this kind of family reunion, which was beautiful and tearful and then fraught. And the woman, the wife, stormed out of the office. And anyway.
A day in the life of a real estate agent.
Anything can happen.
Anything can happen. So did you sell it in the end?
No.
Wow.
Funnily enough, saw it for sale again with a different agency just about a month or two ago. Saw it online.
Wow.
And I was like, there it is. There's that property again. Still the same owners. Yeah, don't know what happened there.
Yeah. So the dumbo could be, there's lots of dumbos in there. Interesting. So thanks for sharing that story. I do love the humility of a story that doesn't necessarily, set you up in a blaze of glory. I love it. It's the realness of real estate, that one. So I thought, thanks so much, Jake. It's been great to meet you today. You were recommended to me to come onto the podcast, and I think it's been a great discussion. I think it's got into some interesting stuff, looking to the future as to what is coming, some bit of warts and all stuff, a bit of reality around the challenges associated with that, but also the motivations behind government legislation, et cetera, et cetera. So look, we'll have to get you back because I know there's a few other topics that I think that we'll be keen to go deep on. So thank you again.
My pleasure, Veronica. Absolute pleasure to chat with you today.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.